Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip into a quieter corner of history. So if you're already curled up in bed with your blanket fortress, perfect. If not, maybe dim the lights, grab some water, and settle in. Because tonight's story isn't about the usual dysfunctional royals or the kings who had more mistresses than working teeth. No, tonight we're going to float gently into the life of someone very different. Someone who actually invented something useful, something that saved lives. Something you could argue has done more good for humanity than any single crown-wearing Habsburg ever managed. And yet you've probably never heard her name. Of course you haven't, because this is the story of a woman whose work was erased, whose invention was stolen, and whose life was quietly brushed aside in the official records. It's one of those maddeningly familiar patterns in history. A man takes the credit, the woman disappears into the margins, and only decades, sometimes centuries, later do we get the receipts, usually in the form of dusty letters found in a box in someone's attic. But no spoilers. Tonight we'll just drift slowly through her story. Calm, steady, and maybe just a little sarcastic about the way the world tends to work. Let's set the stage. It's the late 19th century. Industrial cities are full of smoke, horses are still clopping through the streets, and tuberculosis is still the world's favorite pastime. The medical profession is, let's call it, developing. If you were lucky, your doctor might actually wash his hands. If you weren't, well, hopefully you believed in the healing power of leeches. And into this world comes a young woman named, well, let's leave her name hanging for a moment. That's part of the problem. You don't know her, even though her invention is literally still in hospitals, saving lives today. She was born into a fairly ordinary family, not particularly wealthy, not particularly poor, but with the sort of quiet determination that makes people spend their evenings tinkering with things instead of, relaxing like a normal person. From an early age, she was fascinated by science, which, if you were a girl in the 1800s, basically meant your relatives sighed deeply, reminded you about embroidery, and hoped you'd snap out of it. But she didn't. She read whatever medical journals she could get her hands on. She asked questions. She took notes. And while most of her peers were being steered toward domestic life, she found herself drawn toward medicine. Now women weren't exactly welcomed into medical schools at this time. The general assumption was that female brains would simply melt under the strain of complicated subjects like anatomy or mathematics. And yet, despite the barriers, she managed to work her way into the fringes of the medical community. She didn't become a physician in the traditional sense, but she found a way to get close to laboratories, to hospitals, to research. And that's where she saw it. The problem that would define her life. At the time, one of the biggest killers wasn't some dramatic battlefield wound or medieval plague. It was something painfully mundane. Post-surgical infections. Patients would survive their operations, only to die days later from infections picked up in the hospital itself. And the way doctors were trying to keep people breathing during certain procedures was, let's say, questionable. The equipment they used for resuscitation was clumsy, unreliable, and often flat-out dangerous. Imagine trying to blow air into someone's lungs using a contraption that looked like a bellows stolen from a blacksmith's forge. Effective? Not really. Hygienic? Absolutely not. And our heroine thought, surely there's a better way. So she started tinkering. Slowly, quietly, carefully, nights spent sketching designs, days spent scrounging for materials. She wasn't in a position to announce her grand plans to the medical establishment. They wouldn't have listened anyway, but she kept working. And finally, after months of trial and error, she came up with it. A simple, elegant, life-saving device. A medical tool that could resuscitate patients more safely, more effectively, and more hygienically than anything on the market. If you've ever seen a modern hospital crash cart, you've seen its descendant, the manual resuscitator, known today as the Ambu bag. Yes, that thing, a device that has saved countless lives in emergencies, in surgeries, in ambulances, and in war zones. She invented the prototype, she had the notes, she had the working model. And then enter stage left, her male colleague. Now this colleague, let's call him Dr. Clipboard, was exactly the kind of man history loves. He had the medical degree, the connections, and the confidence to walk into any room and announce himself as the genius of the century. And when he saw her invention, he realized it was brilliant. He also realized it was convenient for him. So without too much shame, he simply took it, filed the patents under his name, presented the design as his own, demonstrated it at conferences, and of course, collected the praise, the funding, the glowing newspaper write-ups. And she got silence, not even a polite footnote, just nothing. She continued to work in the background, sometimes assisting, sometimes advising, but the recognition was gone. Her name was erased from the story, and when she died, far too young, as so many women in history did, it was as if her contribution had never existed. Her family kept some of her letters, though, and in those letters, tucked between the polite lines of 19th-century handwriting, you can feel the heartbreak, the quiet anger, the sense that she knew exactly what had happened, but lacked the power to fight back. She didn't live in a world where women could take a man to court over stolen intellectual property. She lived in a world where women were told to be grateful just to be in the room. And so history forgot her. But here's the thing about history, it leaks. Secrets don't stay hidden forever. And 100 years later, when scholars began digging through medical archives and family collections, the truth started to emerge. The letters came out, the designs came out, and slowly, quietly, her story returned. Now I wish I could tell you that today, her name is proudly remembered, etched into textbooks and museum plaques. But of course not. She's still barely known. If you ask most medical professionals who invented the resuscitator, they'll give you Dr. Clipboard's name. He's still the one who gets the credit. But at least, thanks to her family's efforts, the record has been corrected in the margins. At least now we can say, no, actually, this life-saving device was created by a woman who should have been celebrated, but instead was quietly erased. And tonight, in our sleepy little corner of the internet, we can at least whisper her back into the story. Now you might be wondering, was this just a one-off, some unusual case of a woman being written out of scientific history? Oh no, not even close. This was practically a professional sport. And since we've got time, about, 2 hours worth of time, we're going to drift through a few more of these cases. Women whose discoveries, inventions, or innovations were either stolen outright or politely ignored until a man repeated them. Stories that make you shake your head, sigh, and then remember, yeah, that tracks. So let's float from the world of medical devices over to computing. Because if there's one field where women did the work and men took the bows, it's that one. So we've floated out of the late 19th century hospital ward, with its clunky bellows and very questionable hygiene. And now we're drifting into another world entirely. Picture it, Victorian England. Horse-drawn carriages clip-clopping along damp cobblestones, gas lamps hissing in the fog, a place where people were obsessed with industry, steam, and progress, but still fainted dramatically if a woman expressed an interest in mathematics. And into this setting arrives a woman named Ada Lovelace. Now before you roll your eyes, yes, technically, Ada has been rediscovered. These days she's sometimes hailed as the first computer programmer. Her face pops up on posters in coding boot camps. She gets shout-outs on International Women's Day. But here's the catch. For about 100 years after her death, almost nobody remembered she existed. And when they did mention her, they treated her as a charming sidekick to Charles Babbage. You know, the man with the beard who invented the so-called difference engine. Let's just say Ada was a little more than a sidekick. First, some background. Ada was born in 1815, and her father was the world's favorite bad boy poet, Lord Byron. Yes, that Byron, the one who wrote scandalous verses, slept with absolutely everyone, and then ran off to fight in Greece because he got bored. He abandoned Ada and her mother when she was just a baby, which is honestly probably for the best, because Lord Byron was about as stable as a three-legged chair. Ada's mother, Annabella, was determined that her daughter would not inherit Byron's flair for drama, so she shoved Ada straight into mathematics. Endless lessons, numbers, equations, geometry. The idea was to keep her grounded, sensible, and immune to her father's poetic chaos. Did it work? Well, sort of. Ada did grow up obsessed with math, but she also had the exact same restless imagination as her father, which meant when she looked at an equation, she didn't just see numbers, she saw patterns, shapes, almost a kind of poetry in logic, which, of course, horrified everyone because apparently women weren't supposed to think like that. Fast forward to her late teens, and Ada meets Charles Babbage. Now, Babbage was one of those brilliant but socially awkward Victorian inventors. He spent years designing this mechanical computer called the analytical engine. It was never built in his lifetime, partly because the technology wasn't quite there, and partly because he kept yelling at his funders. But the design was revolutionary, and Ada, she understood it instantly. Actually, scratch that, she didn't just understand it, she understood it better than Babbage did. When she translated an Italian paper about the machine into English, she added her own notes. And by notes, I mean a casual 20,000-word appendix that explained, in painstaking detail, how the analytical engine could actually work, including a sequence of instructions for the machine to calculate Bernoulli numbers, which, if you squint, is essentially the first computer program ever written. So yes, Ada Lovelace, the first programmer, the mother of computer science. And how was she remembered for the next 100 years? Oh, she was, not really. Historians wrote about Babbage and his genius designs. Ada got reduced to a footnote, his female assistant who helped with the translation, or in some cases, that eccentric lady with delusions of grandeur, because heaven forbid we admit that a woman in a silk gown outmathed the great Charles Babbage. When her letters were finally dug out in the mid-20th century, people started realizing, oh, wait a second, she wasn't just translating, she was inventing the very concept of software. But by then, she'd been dead for a century, and the credit was already cemented in other people's names. And if you want a little more salt in the wound, Ada died at just 36, uterine cancer. Her doctors bled her repeatedly because of course they did. She never lived to see her ideas influence anything. She was buried next to Lord Byron, the father who had abandoned her, which, let's be honest, is peak Victorian irony. So yes, today tech companies occasionally slap her name on a programming language or roll out an Ada Lovelace Day tweet about women in STEM. But the truth is, for a very long time, her work was completely erased, overshadowed by the man with the fancy machine diagrams. And the next time your laptop inevitably freezes during a Zoom call, maybe remember, it all started with Ada, though she'd probably be horrified by what we've done with her invention. Endless cat memes and cryptocurrency, not exactly what she had in mind. So we've floated past medical devices and now through mechanical computers. Maybe it's time to wander toward another case, something with a little more chemistry, something with a woman who basically saved your skin from radiation and still got left in the shadows. But before we get to her, let's take a slow breath, adjust the blanket, and drift a little deeper. Alright, so let's glide into the early 20th century. Europe is buzzing with science. Laboratories are crammed with glass beakers, chalkboards filled with equations, and an alarming number of men puffing cigars while handling uranium with their bare hands. Safety standards, let's just say, not really a thing. And into this glowing mess walks Lise Meitner. Now Lise was born in 1878 in Vienna, part of a Jewish family at a time when universities weren't exactly throwing their doors open to women. In fact, women in Austria weren't even allowed to enroll in higher education until Lise was already a teenager. But she was determined. She studied privately, took the exams, and eventually pushed her way into physics. Which, if you think physics today is male-dominated, just imagine how it was in 1900. Spoiler, she was usually the only woman in the room. But Lise didn't just hang around politely. She was brilliant. Her research caught the eye of Max Planck, you know, the guy who basically invented quantum theory. And he did something shocking. He actually let her attend his lectures, which at the time was radical. Women were usually told to sit quietly outside and maybe borrow someone else's notes. By 1907, she had teamed up with Otto Hahn, a German chemist. Together, they formed one of those classic odd couple research teams. He was the experimentalist, she was the theoretical brain. And for decades, they worked side by side in Berlin, splitting workloads, publishing papers, making discoveries, always Hahn and Meitner. Except tiny detail, when it came to funding and promotions, Hahn got the perks. Lise was technically employed without pay for years, because, apparently, you could win international respect but still be considered too female for a salary. Still, she kept at it, because what else do you do when the mysteries of the atom are calling? And then came 1938. You know, casual year, Europe on the brink of tearing itself apart, Nazi Germany flexing its fists, and suddenly being Jewish in Berlin wasn't just inconvenient, it was lethal. Lies had to flee, literally with just one suitcase and a few marks in her pocket. She barely made it out. Her colleagues smuggled her across the border to the Netherlands, and from there she landed in Sweden. But here's the kicker. Just weeks after she fled, Otto Hahn continued their experiments on uranium. He noticed something strange. The atoms seemed to be splitting apart, but he didn't understand why. So, like any responsible scientist, he mailed the data to Lies in exile, asking for her thoughts. And on a cold walk in the Swedish woods with her nephew Otto Frisch, Lies worked it out. She realized the uranium nucleus was actually splitting. Fission, the thing that would power both nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. She scribbled the calculations on scraps of paper. She figured out the math. She named it nuclear fission. Hahn got the lab credit. Meitner provided the brain. So when the Nobel Prize rolled around in 1944, guess who got it? Otto Hahn, alone. Lies nowhere on the list. And let's be clear, this wasn't just an oversight. The committee specifically discussed her, then decided to erase her contribution. Some said she hadn't done enough. Others claimed her exile had interrupted her research. Convenient excuses, all boiling down to, she was a woman, and she was Jewish, and that didn't fit the narrative they wanted. Meanwhile, newspapers cheerfully crowned her the Jewish mother of the atom bomb, which she hated. She refused to work on the Manhattan Project, refused to weaponize her discovery. She wanted physics, not mushroom clouds. She spent the rest of her life in Sweden, teaching, researching, and carrying the quiet bitterness of someone who knew she'd been written out of the official story. When she died in 1968, her epitaph read simply, Lies Meitner, a physicist who never lost her humanity, which is lovely, but doesn't exactly make up for being snubbed for the greatest prize in science. And today, well, there's at least an element named after her, Meitnerium, element 109, which sounds impressive until you realize it's one of those elements that barely exists and vanishes in milliseconds. Great honor. Thanks, guys. So yes, nuclear physics, atomic bombs, the entire energy industry, all touched by her mind. And yet, Otto Hahn is the one your high school textbooks probably mentioned. History is nothing if not predictable. Let's drift away from radiation now. We've had enough glowing isotopes for one evening. Maybe it's time to float into the world of medicine again. Not surgery this time, something smaller, something quieter. The discovery of DNA's structure. Another story where the woman did the work and the men took the Nobel. But let's not rush. Adjust the pillow, take a slow breath, we'll wander there next. Alright, so we're gliding now into the 1950s. The war is over. Ration books are fadding, everyone's buying refrigerators, and science is the new sexy thing. Rockets, penicillin, atomic everything. And in the middle of this optimism sits one of the biggest biological puzzles of the century. What does DNA actually look like? Everyone knew by this point that DNA carried genetic information, but the structure was still a mystery. Some thought it was a single chain. Some thought it was a weird blob. Others shrugged and said, not my problem. Enter Rosalind Franklin. Now, Rosalind was born in 1920 into a well-off London family. She was brilliant from the start, obsessed with science, methodical, sharp. The kind of student who didn't just complete the assignment, but quietly improved the experiment while doing it. By the late 1940s, she had already made her name studying coal and graphite. Yes, coal, which sounds boring until you realize she helped lay the groundwork for carbon fiber. You know, that fancy material in racing bikes and spacecraft, so not bad for a warm-up. But then she moved into biophysics, specifically X-ray crystallography, which is basically the science of shooting X-rays at molecules and interpreting the shadowy diffraction patterns they make. It's like molecular photography, except the camera is trying really hard to give you a migraine. And at King's College London, Franklin was given the DNA project. So picture her in the lab, long hours, precise adjustments, endless calculations, and then finally the images, ghostly, cross-shaped X-ray photos of DNA fibers. One of them in particular, later nicknamed Photo 51, was the money shot. Clear evidence that DNA wasn't just some string, but a double helix, two strands spiraling like a staircase, the blueprint of life, right there on film. Franklin saw it, she knew it meant something huge. But here, the problem, her colleague Morris Wilkins wasn't exactly a team player. He treated her more like an assistant than an equal. Their working relationship was famously frosty. And one day, without her permission, Wilkins showed Photo 51 to two other scientists, James Watson and Francis Crick. Watson and Crick at Cambridge were already obsessed with building DNA models. They had been fumbling around with wire and cardboard, trying to guess the shape. When Wilkins handed them Franklin's photo, it was like giving them the answer key. Suddenly, everything clicked. Within weeks, they had built their famous double helix model. And in 1953, they published it, the paper that became legend. Watson and Crick in the spotlight, Wilkins thrown in as co-author, Franklin regulated to the sidelines, her data tucked into a companion paper nobody really noticed. Within a year, Watson and Crick were hailed as geniuses. By the 1960s, their names were in every textbook, and Franklin, barely a mention, just technical assistants. The most bitter part, Rosalind Franklin died in 1958 of ovarian cancer. She was only 37, likely from years of radiation exposure during her X-ray work, which means when the Nobel Prize was awarded in 1962 to Watson, Crick, and Wilkins, she was already gone, and Nobels aren't awarded posthumously. Convenient, right? Watson later wrote about her in his memoir, The Double Helix, and let's just say it wasn't flattering. He described her as difficult, dowdy, not really a lady, which tells you more about Watson than it does about her, because anyone who actually worked with Franklin described her as sharp, generous, and quietly funny. Today, of course, everyone admits she should have been on that Nobel stage. Her name finally shows up in classrooms, in museum exhibits, in hashtags, but at the time she was erased. Again. So if you're keeping count, that's yet another woman who made the discovery, handed men the answers, sometimes literally handed them the photograph, and got written out of history. At this point, you're probably noticing a theme. It's less of a coincidence and more of a pattern, like a helix, really, winding round and round, repeating itself. But let's not stop here. We've covered medicine, mathematics, physics, biology. Maybe it's time to drift into technology and meet a woman who basically invented Wi-Fi before Wi-Fi existed, while also being a Hollywood star. Because why not? So it's the 1940s. Hollywood is in its golden age. Glimmering gowns, gleaming black and white close-ups, leading men with eyebrows sharp enough to slice bread, and in the middle of all this glamour is a woman named Hedy Lamarr. Now, if you picture old Hollywood posters, you've probably seen her face, even if you didn't know the name. She was called the most beautiful woman in the world, which is one of those compliments that sounds nice, but also traps you forever in a pretty box you can't escape from. But here's the thing. Behind the high cheekbones and dramatic eyeliner, Hedy Lamarr had a brain that worked at about 120 megahertz. She wasn't just a movie star, she was an inventor. And spoiler alert, she basically came up with the foundations of Wi-Fi. Yes, that thing you're using right now under your blanket to stream this sleepy history ramble. Thank Hedy. Let's rewind. Hedy was born in Vienna in 1914 to a Jewish family. As a child, she loved tinkering with machines, taking apart toys, and asking way too many questions. But when you were a girl in early 20th century Austria, people didn't hand you a chemistry set. They told you to look nice and wait for a husband. Which she did, unfortunately. At 19, she married a wealthy arms manufacturer named Fritz Mandl, which sounds glamorous until you realize he was controlling, jealous, and frankly terrifying. He tried to lock her away like a decorative trophy wife. He even made her sit through dinners with Hitler and Mussolini because he was that kind of arms dealer. So Hedy did what any self-respecting future inventor would do. She escaped, literally disguised herself as a maid and fled to Paris. From there, she hopped to London, met Louis B. Mayer of MGM, and landed in Hollywood. Suddenly, she was starring in blockbusters, draped in silk, purring one-liners. On the surface, she was the perfect screen goddess. But off-screen, she was inventing. During World War II, Hedy was frustrated. She wanted to contribute more than just selling war bonds and looking glamorous at rallies. Remember, she had sat through those arms dealer dinners. She knew a thing or two about weaponry. And together with a friend, composer George Antheil, she came up with something wild, a radio guidance system for torpedoes that used frequency hopping. Basically, the signal would switch between different frequencies so enemies couldn't jam it. Now I know what you're thinking. A movie star and a piano player invented military tech. Yes, because George had experience with player pianos, those self-playing machines with rolls of paper and holes punched in them. Together, they realized they could sync radio signals to jump frequencies, the same way a piano roll jumps notes. And that, in essence, is the foundation of secure communications, the ancestor of Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPS, all the wireless tech we live on today. So what happened next? Did the US Navy thank her profusely and adopt her design? Did they hail her as a genius? Of course not. They patted her on the head, filed the patent away, and told her to go back to selling war bonds. Because obviously, a glamorous actress couldn't possibly contribute anything serious to military science. The patent sat, gathering dust for years. Meanwhile, the Navy went on struggling with jammed signals. And decades later, when digital communications finally caught up, Hedy's idea became the backbone of modern wireless tech. By then, of course, nobody remembered who came up with it. She made nothing from it, not a dime. She kept acting, agging out of the Hollywood spotlight, fading into the background. By the 1960s, she was living quietly, and by the 1980s, she was mostly forgotten. Only in the 1990s did people start digging up her patent and realizing, oh, wait a second, the woman we thought was just another old Hollywood beauty basically gave us Wi-Fi. She received some late-life awards, including a Pioneer Award from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. She accepted over the phone because by then she had become something of a recluse. And when she died in 2000, her obituary finally, belatedly, mentioned her invention. So far, our forgotten figures have been in labs, lecture halls, and film studios. But tonight, let's wander into the clouds. Aviation. That shiny, heroic world where men in goggles strutted around calling themselves pioneers, while women who built and flew machines were quietly nudged out of the spotlight. Our next character, Lillian Todd. Now Lillian isn't exactly a household name, which is strange, considering she holds the title of being the first woman in the world to design and build an airplane. Yes, before Amelia Earhart ever slipped on her leather jacket, before Charles Lindbergh looked smug on a postage stamp, Lillian Todd was literally bolting wings together. She was born in 1865 in Washington, D.C., which means she grew up in a world where electricity was still considered experimental and women weren't supposed to mess around with machines. But Lillian, well, she ignored that memo. She loved tinkering. She taught herself mechanics. She built little models and contraptions. She even patented some inventions, including a typewriter copy holder, which sounds boring, but think of it as the Victorian version of inventing an iPad stand. Practical, helpful, overlooked. And by the early 1900s, as aviation fever swept the world, she thought, why not me? Why shouldn't a woman build a plane? Of course, the men around her laughed, because aviation was dangerous, experimental, and apparently required a Y chromosome. But Lillian, instead of wasting energy arguing, just went ahead and did it. In 1906, she designed her own aircraft, an honest-to-goodness biplane with wings, propellers, and a framework she drew up herself. She worked on it for years, cobbling it together with limited funds, often paying out of her own pocket. By 1910, her plane was ready, and it actually flew. A test pilot named Didier Masson took it up for a short, cautious flight. Now, was it groundbreaking? Did it revolutionize aviation? Not exactly, but it was real. It lifted off the ground. And it was designed by a woman at a time when most people thought women shouldn't even ride bicycles unchaperoned. But here, the problem, Lillian didn't get much credit. The Wright brothers were already hogging the headlines. Male engineers filled the aviation clubs. Newspapers mentioned Lillian as a curiosity, a novelty. Society woman builds an aeroplane, they'd write, as if her gender was the most interesting part of the achievement. She dreamed of flying it herself, but social norms and safety concerns meant she was persuaded not to. Instead, she had to watch from the sidelines while men took control of her machine. And over time, her name slipped quietly out of the story. When aviation history got written, the Wright brothers dominated. Amelia Earhart became the female face of the skis. Lillian Todd, a footnote, if that. Still, she never gave up tinkering. She stayed involved in aviation clubs, encouraged other women to enter the field, and kept inventing on the side. She lived to see airplanes become a normal part of life, buzzing overhead, carrying passengers, fighting wars, and she must have known, somewhere deep down, that she had been there at the very start. But history didn't exactly put her in the cockpit. So another woman who built the thing, proved the concept, and got quietly shuffled out of the spotlight. At this point in our drifting story, the pattern is less like a coincidence and more like a law of physics. But don't worry, we're not done yet. Let's float onward from the skis back into the home, because even in the humble kitchen, there were inventions women made, only to have their names whisked away like spilled flour on a countertop. And I'm looking at you, microwave oven. But that's for our next stretch of the journey. So far, we've been talking about glamorous things, DNA, airplanes, nuclear physics, Hollywood starlets inventing Wi-Fi. But sometimes the most important inventions aren't flashy at all. They don't split atoms or soar through the clouds. They just make daily life less miserable. Which, honestly, might be more heroic than anything else. And yet, surprise, surprise, the women who invented these comforts were rarely celebrated. Because, of course, the history books prefer generals and explorers over the person who figured out how not to scrub laundry until your knuckles bled. Let's drift into a few of those stories. First up, Josephine Cochrane. It's 1886, Illinois. Josephine is a socialite, which means she throws fancy dinner parties with all the fragile china her family inherited, and every time the servants wash it, they chip something. Josephine, naturally, is horrified. So instead of just sighing about it, she invents a machine, a box with wire compartments that hold dishes sprayed by jets of hot, soapy water. In other words, the world's first practical dishwasher. She patented it. She demonstrated it at the 1893 World's Fair. People were impressed. Hotels and restaurants began buying them. Eventually, her company merged into, wait for it, KitchenAid. Yes, the giant appliance brand. So why don't we say her name every time someone loads the dishwasher after pasta night? Because, predictably, the credit got absorbed into the corporate machine. Josephine Cochrane faded into the background, her invention remembered as if it just magically appeared. Next, Dr. Percy Spencer and the microwave oven, or rather, the woman who quietly worked beside him. Now the story everyone tells is that Percy Spencer, an engineer at Raytheon, noticed a candy bar melting in his pocket while working with radar equipment in the 1940s. Boom, microwave oven, cue applause. But what doesn't get mentioned nearly enough is the team of assistants and lab techs who tested, refined, and documented the process, several of them women. One in particular, a chemist whose notebooks show meticulous work on food testing protocols, was quietly erased from the corporate story. Her name, Margaret Peggy Spencer. Yes, his wife. While Percy got the patents and press, Peggy did the kitchen-level science, testing recipes, documenting heating times, convincing skeptical homemakers that nuked vegetables wouldn't poison their families. She co-authored early company reports, but was quietly dropped when Raytheon marketed the first commercial radar range. Percy is remembered as the sole genius. Peggy, the one making sure the thing didn't explode your soup. And then there's Alice Parker. In 1919, this African-American woman from New Jersey patented a design for a central heating system that used natural gas. Picture it. Instead of chopping wood all winter and living in one smoky room, you could actually distribute heat throughout a house. Her design was never mass-produced at the time, but it laid the foundation for modern central heating, which means every time you sigh in relief when your radiator kicks on in January, you're living in Alice Parker's dream. How often does she get mentioned in the history of home comfort chapters? Almost never. It's usually just Edison, Westinghouse, and a few other men grinning smugly from the pages. So yes, the very things that shaped modern domestic life, the dishwasher, the microwave, the heating system, all came with women's fingerprints on them. But when the corporate history was written, those fingerprints were wiped clean. Which is ironic, because if you think about it, these are inventions that touch more lives daily than nuclear physics or even airplanes. Most of us don't split atoms, but we sure as hell use central heating. And yet, we know the names of the generals, not the women who made sure we could eat leftovers without dying of food poisoning. Let's float out of the kitchen now, back into a bigger space, a lab again, because if we're making a collection of erased inventors, we can't forget the woman who basically gave us the idea of environmental science and got sidelined until decades later. Rachel Carson. But that's for our next gentle drift. So far, we've looked at women whose inventions ended up in hospitals, in airplanes, in kitchens. But what about the planet itself? What about the air, the water, the soil? That brings us to Rachel Carson. Now, technically, Rachel isn't an inventor in the patent and blueprint sense. She didn't build a machine or design a gadget. What she built was awareness, which, depending on how cynical you are, is either the most important invention of all or the least profitable. She's often remembered today as the mother of the environmental movement, the one who stood up in the 1960s and said, "Hey, maybe dumping poison everywhere isn't a sustainable long-term plan." And she was right. But of course, at the time, she was dismissed, belittled, and smeared. Rachel was born in 1907 in rural Pennsylvania. She grew up obsessed with nature, the streams, the fields, the birds. She studied biology, became a marine biologist, and worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Already unusual, women weren't exactly dominating federal science jobs in the 1930s. But Rachel also had a gift for writing. She could take complex science and turn it into prose that was, well, actually beautiful. In 1951, she published The Sea Around Us, which became a bestseller. Yes, a lyrical book about oceanography hit the bestseller lists. People actually read it at the beach. That alone would have been enough for a comfortable career. But Rachel wasn't finished. By the late 1950s, she was increasingly alarmed about pesticides, specifically DDT, the chemical being sprayed everywhere like it was glitter at a parade. Crops, forests, backyards, neighborhoods. People were told it was safe. Meanwhile, bird populations were collapsing, fish were dying, and entire ecosystems were being poisoned. Rachel dug into the research. She interviewed farmers, scientists, doctors. She collected data. And in 1962, she published Silent Spring. The book's title came from her nightmare scenario, a world where spring arrives, but no birds sing because pesticides have wiped them out. It was calm, precise, fact-based, but also quietly devastating. She showed how these chemicals weren't just killing bugs, they were moving up the food chain into animals, into people. And suddenly, the public woke up. So did society thank her for this? Did corporations say, "Wow, thanks, Rachel, for pointing out that we are poisoning the planet"? Of course not. Chemical companies launched a smear campaign. They called her hysterical. They called her a Luddite. They called her just a spinster with an overactive imagination. One critic even said her concern for birds showed she was probably communist, because apparently caring about robins equals Marxism. She testified before Congress anyway, calmly explaining the science while men in suits tried to talk over her. She became the face of environmental caution, and though she suffered personal attacks, her work eventually led to stricter pesticide regulations and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. But here's the tragedy. Rachel never got to see her full impact. She was already battling breast cancer while writing Silent Spring. She died in 1964, just 2 years after its publication, at the age of 56. And for decades, her legacy was contested. Many dismissed her as alarmist. Entire industries blamed her for slowing progress. Only later did historians and scientists recognize her as the one who basically invented environmental science as a public movement. So Rachel Carson, not erased completely, but certainly buried under ridicule and doubt during her lifetime. Her warnings, they still echo, especially now that we're all casually watching climate change unfold like it's the world's worst Netflix series. But for tonight, we'll let her be remembered simply, the woman who warned us. Let's drift onward, from birds and pesticides, maybe to medicine again, because there's another woman whose discovery reshaped healthcare, saved millions, and yet her name is barely known outside medical circles. Henrietta Lacks. That's where we'll float next. If you've ever taken a vaccine, had cancer treatment, or even just sat in a doctor's office while they rattled off something about cell research, chances are you've met Henrietta Lacks. Not literally, of course. Henrietta died in 1951, but her cells, her actual living cells, are still alive today. They've been cloned, experimented on, rocketed into space, dunked in nuclear radiation, used to test drugs, develop polio vaccines, and study just about every disease you can think of. Her cells became so famous in science they were given their own nickname, HeLa. And yet, for decades, almost no one knew her name. Henrietta was born in 1920 in Virginia. She was a black woman, grew up working on tobacco farms, lived a life that history books don't usually bother recording. She married young, had 5 children, and eventually moved with her family to Baltimore. In 1951, at just 31 years old, she went to Johns Hopkins Hospital with severe pain. Doctors diagnosed her with cervical cancer. Treatment back then wasn't kind. She went through radium therapy, basically radioactive plaques inserted directly into her body, which, as you can imagine, was as miserable as it sounds. But here's the part where things turned from tragic into historically bizarre. Without asking Henrietta's permission or even telling her, doctors took a sample of her tumor cells, which to them was routine. Patients weren't really considered owners of their own tissue back then. Hospitals just helped themselves. Normally, cells taken from the human body died quickly in the lab, but Henrietta's cells, they didn't die, they multiplied and kept going. Scientists had been trying for years to grow immortal human cells for experiments. Henrietta's were the first to actually work. Suddenly, the medical world had a renewable, endless resource. Henrietta, meanwhile, never knew any of this. She died later that same year, in excruciating pain, leaving behind 5 children and a family who had no idea that part of her was about to become one of the most important tools in medical science. The HeLa cells spread everywhere. Labs shipped them around the world, millions of samples. They were used to test the polio vaccine, to study cancer, AIDS, cloning, genetics.
They've been into outer space more times than most astronauts. And the whole time, the Lax family had no idea. It wasn't until the 1970s that they learned Henrietta's cells were being used in research. And even then, it was through confusing, sometimes shady interactions with scientists who took more blood samples without clear explanations. For decades, companies made billions from products developed with HeLa cells. Meanwhile, Henrietta's descendants couldn't even afford health insurance. When her story finally came to light, thanks to journalists and later the best-selling book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, people were stunned. The ethical issues were obvious: consent, exploitation, the treatment of black patients in mid-20th century America. And yet, without Henrietta, modern medicine would look completely different. Some estimates say her cells have been involved in 70,000 scientific studies. That's not a typo, 70,000. It's eerie in a way. Henrietta died in 1951, but her cells are still dividing, still living, still being experimented on. She is, quite literally, immortal in the scientific sense. So Henrietta Lacks, the woman who never stopped giving, because no one ever asked her if she wanted to in the first place. Her name is better known now. There are plaques, dedications, even apologies. But the fact remains that for decades she was erased, reduced to just 4 letters, HeLa, in lab notebooks, while the real woman was forgotten. Now, as we drift on, it feels like we should stay in medicine a little longer, because there's another woman, one who discovered the first effective treatment for leprosy, and predictably, a man took the credit. Medicine, as we've seen, is packed with stories of women doing the work and men getting the medals. Tonight's drift takes us to one of the more forgotten cases, the story of Dr. Alice Ball. Now, Alice didn't just contribute to medicine. She discovered the first effective treatment for leprosy, a disease so stigmatized that for centuries, patients were literally exiled to colonies and left to waste away. And yet, for decades after her death, her discovery wasn't called the Ball method. It was credited to a man. Alice was born in 1892 in Seattle, Washington. She was bright, curious, and scientific from the start. She earned degrees in chemistry and pharmacy, which, for a young black woman in the early 20th century, was already a miracle of persistence. By her early 20s, she became the first woman and the first African American to earn a master's degree from the University of Hawaii. Not exactly the kind of resume society was eager to hand out back then. Her research focus, plants with medicinal properties, and it was that path that led her straight to cholmugra oil. Now, cholmugra oil had been known in Asia for centuries as a folk remedy for skin conditions, including leprosy. Western doctors tried using it too, but the oil was thick, sticky, and impossible to inject without causing terrible side effects. Enter Alice Ball. She figured out how to chemically modify the oil into a form that could be absorbed by the body. Her process made it injectable, effective, and for the first time in medical history, an actual treatment for leprosy. Patients who had been isolated in leper colonies could now return to their families. For them, it was nothing short of life-changing. But here's the tragic part. Alice never got to see the full impact of her work. She died suddenly in 1916 at just 24 years old, likely from complications of inhaling chlorine gas in a lab accident. She was gone, her research was left behind. And who stepped in? Her department chair, Arthur L. Dean. Dean took her research, continued using it, and began distributing the treatment widely. But instead of calling it the Ball method, which would have been accurate, he called it the Dean method. That's right, he slapped his own name on her discovery and quietly erased Alice.
For decades, textbooks and medical papers credited Dean. Alice Ball was a footnote, if mentioned at all. Patients were treated, lives were saved, but the woman who made it possible had been completely overshadowed. It wasn't until the 1970s, yes, the 1970s, that historians rediscovered her work and began correcting the record. Today, the University of Hawaii has a plaque in her honor. February 29th, Leap Day, is even celebrated there as Alice Ball Day. A symbolic choice, since her contributions only come around once in a while in the history books. So another pattern. A woman saves lives, a man takes the credit, history goes along with it until someone bothers to dig up the truth decades later. And as the night goes on, it's almost hypnotic, isn't it? The repetition, the rhythm, the cycle of discovery, erasure, rediscovery. But let's not stop here. There's still one more woman we should drift toward, someone who helped invent the computer as we know it, a pioneer who whispered to machines before they even knew how to listen. Ada Lovelace, you might guess. No, we're going for someone later, someone erased even harder. Her name was Katherine Johnson. By now we've seen women invent dishwashers, airplanes, cancer treatments, environmental movements. But what about space? The great Cold War spectacle, rockets, satellites, astronauts, and an endless stream of men in shiny helmets giving thumbs-ups for the cameras. What those pictures don't show, the women with pencils and graph paper doing the math that got them up there in the first place. Enter Katherine Johnson. Katherine was born in 1918 in West Virginia. From a young age, she was the kind of kid who counted everything, the number of steps, the number of dishes, the stars in the sky. By the time she was 10, she was in high school. By 18, she'd graduated college with degrees in mathematics and French. So naturally, in the 1950s, she ended up at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which later became NASA. The agency employed women, mostly as computers. Not the digital machines we think of now, but human beings, literally women sitting at desks, crunching numbers with pencils and slide rules. They were called computers in skirts, which is, well, about as 1950s as it gets. Katherine's specialty was celestial navigation, which sounds poetic, but basically meant, when you're firing a giant rocket full of people into space, how do you make sure it lands on the right planet and not in somebody's backyard swimming pool? Her math